what's your driving force? Like, what's your motivator? Like, why do you keep doing what you're doing?
I like winning. I like to win. I like the thrill of the contest. But I think a lot of that had to do with the disadvantageous venue and the moderators. It was indeed a 3-on-1 debate. So that's how I met Trump. As early as 1988, it occurred to me that Donald Trump should run for president. If you ask him about him today, he'll say it was Roger's idea. He always loved the idea more than I did.
I think the wrong side has too much of a voice, and the people that have their faith in Christ and the people that believe in good aren't as vocal as this side. Do you think that what's happening within America, the crazy riots, almost censorship of the wrong things, but the right things, and then the wrong things are being publicized, like, do you think that stems from the lack of fear of God? I do want to open up with what I feel like is the most relevant topic, because it was literally yesterday. This interview will go up Thursday, the 12th. Debate was the 10th. I want to get your take on it. What is your take on the debate yesterday?
Well, first of all, you could, of course, never judge an event in the eye of the storm. So until you have a chance to see through polling how the public reacted to it, it's a little hard to judge the impact on the presidential contest. Okay. Those things are also not only affected by the event itself, but they're affected by other people's interpretation of the event, how the media covers it, how it's reflected in the internet, and so on. Traditionally, there's actually an old Rand Institute study that show that presidential debates in modern times have not really changed races that often, because most of the people who are watching already have their minds made up. The average citizen is less interested. The more casual voter is less interested. Therefore, I'll be interested to see, first of all, how the ratings were, who was watching. Yeah. Were minds changed? Remains to be seen. I thought that the Kamala Harris campaign did a good job of lowering expectations for their candidate. It's a fair statement that she really hasn't spoken any place since she was nominated. No one-on-one interviews, no full-blown press conference, not even answering questions being shouted at her by reporters as she goes from a plane to the car. So there was a reasonable question about whether she could perform in this kind of atmosphere. She also had a difficult job, which is she needs to break loose of Joe Biden because his record, of which she is part, is a disaster, and she knows it. She wants to be a change agent. She wants to take us in a new direction. And, of course, Trump has a similar problem in the sense that he talked a lot about what he had done, but he needs to project that into the future. Politics is always about the future. It's never about the past. So to a certain extent, I think they may have both achieved their goals. The optics for the president were not as good as they usually are. He's actually very good about thinking about the reaction shot and so on. Yeah. But I think a lot of that had to do with the disadvantageous venue and the moderators. It was indeed a 3-on-1 debate.
We were talking about that off camera.
They corrected the president. They fact corrected him or challenged him 11 times. They didn't challenge her, not even once. They gave her follow-ups when they did not give him follow-ups. When he asked her some embarrassing questions, they never came back when she didn't answer them. So, for example, did she meet with Putin? Trump said she did. She didn't say she didn't. She never answered the question. To me, the best moment of the debate was when he stole her money shot line and said, "I'm talking now," because he knew that that was preloaded and she was determined to use it. We shall see. I don't think it changed the race dramatically. Generally speaking, the things that determine how people vote are the things that touch their actual life. People don't vote over abstract concepts. They vote over the cost of a gallon of gasoline. how little their dollar buys when they go to the grocery store, whether they feel safe walking in their neighborhood, whether they know someone who's been killed by an illegal, whether they know someone who died of fentanyl, or whether they've experienced it in their own family. So the American people kind of know things aren't good. You can say they're good all you want. You can say we created a record number of jobs. People don't feel secure in this economy. They know there is no affordable housing. They know that we have a crime epidemic based on open borders. The president never used the word open borders, not once yesterday. So I think in many cases he cut to shorthand in his discussion. And perhaps it required a little more explanation. But all in all, I don't really think it's going to affect the race that much. One of the things that's true about this current electorate is the number of undecideds is very small. The number of the undecideds have an unfavorable opinion of both candidates. Trump's supporters have more intensity. They're more committed. Her supporters have less intensity. It's because they know less about her. Many of them are supporting her because she's the Democrat, not because they have a long-standing knowledge of her.
Yeah.
Remember, when she ran for president on her own, she got 1% of the vote. And there's nothing in her conduct of the office of the vice presidency that would indicate that she's prepared to be president. So I think still has a tough road.
Interesting take. You just mentioned that oftentimes people vote based off the abstract, like the gasoline, the things of the present, right? I also want to get your take on this because I think a majority of the vote that is coming from the left side, that's coming from the opposite, isn't coming from that, but it's more coming from a hate perspective. Oh, you hate Trump too? Oh, yeah.
Yes, there's no question about it. He's a very polarizing figure. You either love him or you hate him. But I don't think that's enough to win an election if people are hurting.
Yeah.
And there are clearly people who voted for him in 2016, or may have voted against him in 2016, who didn't vote for him in 2020. But who will now consider voting for him because basically everything he said was true. Remember, they said, if Trump is elected, he'll get us into a world war. Well, we had no new wars under Donald Trump. They told us if Trump is elected, we'll have a stock market crash. We actually had a record stock market, even after we bounced back from COVID. COVID forces Donald Trump going into re-election to destroy his single greatest accomplishment, the most robust economy in our history, which he does because the doctors tell him it's absolutely necessary for the public health. He's not a doctor, so he decides to destroy a vibrant economy. But because the underlying fundamentals were solid, taxes were low, regulation was low, the banking laws, or I should say the tax laws, had been changed to make bringing capital back in the country advantageous, the economy had already begun to rebound from the the COVID-19 pandemic, and to a certain extent, Biden has been able to take credit for that, where it was the fundamentals under Trump that allowed the economy to bounce back, and the economy was already on its way back. The stock market, before Trump left office, had hit new highs.
13 different presidential campaigns, Trump, Reagan, Nixon, just to name a couple, and you had success at a very young age. Now, outside in what I've studied from other entrepreneurs, from politicians, people that have had massive success over a long career, is that there's typically a different or a bigger motivator than just money, than just fame. Like there's something more to it to keep the longevity in that career. For you, you've had a very long and successful career in politics. What's your driving force? Like, what's your motivator? Like, why do you keep doing what you're doing?
I like winning. I like to win. I like the thrill of the contest. I like combat on behalf of the ideas that I support. I mean, there was a time, obviously, in my business that where I had to take as clients candidates that I didn't love. I never took anybody whose views totally violated mine, but I would love to have been in a position to work only for those who I was completely and totally copacetic with. Very few people have had the opportunity to not just meet, but to work for their heroes. I mean, and this happened only simply because in 1964, when I was 12 years old, the woman who lived next door to us was a very active Republican. I lived in a rural area where there were no kids my age around, which means there are no team sports. No football, no basketball, no baseball, because you can't play those sports by yourself. It's why I never developed any decent hand-eye coordination. So I became a long-distance runner. I became a weightlifter, because those are things you can do by yourself.
Yeah.
So the woman who lived next door to us was very active in the Republican Party. My parents were essentially non-political. My mother had worked in the Price administration, the Office of Price administration during the New Deal, during the Roosevelt administration, but they were non-political. They were nominally Republicans. They had been Democrats. Their families had been Democrats, but Dwight Eisenhower, who was a national war hero, ran for president in 1952, the year I was born, and my parents both voted for Eisenhower, and after that, they considered themselves Republicans, but really not politically involved, not all that politically interested. They voted. That's about it.
So what was your turning point?
The woman who lived next door to us was an active Republican, and she gave me a copy of a book called Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. It's a paperback book. This was 1963, 64, the period in which many in the Republican Party, many of the conservatives, are trying to draft Goldwater to get him to run for president. As I would later learn when I met him, much later, he was a pretty cranky guy. He liked to drink. He liked the showgirls. He was kind of irascible, but he was very good friends with John Kennedy in the Senate, despite the fact that they were from different parties. But they had a good relationship. And Goldwater was interested in running against Kennedy.
Yeah.
But when Kennedy was assassinated, his interest disappeared. First of all, he was smart enough to know that the country would not have 3 presidents in 2 years. So that Lyndon Johnson, who he knew was a crook, who everyone in Washington knew was a crook, was going to get reelected. He thought that a race against Kennedy would be interesting. In fact, he'd proposed to Jack Kennedy, look, what we should do is go around the country together and do these forums together across the country. And Kennedy liked that idea. Johnson would never even debate Goldwater. He'd never even get on the same platform. But there were no debates in 1964. So the truth is, his heart was never in it. He also ran one of the worst campaigns in history in terms of making his message as unpalatable as possible. You don't come to Florida, which at that point had more retirees than any state in the country, and talk about making Social Security voluntary. You don't go to Tennessee and talk about selling the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the source of electricity for most of the South. You certainly don't talk about using nuclear weapons to defoliate the jungles in Vietnam. That scared people. And it allowed Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats to create this caricature of Goldwater as a trigger-happy maniac, a guy who would spark a new world war. Unfairly, they also tagged Goldwater as a racist when in fact Goldwater was one of the original members of the NAACP, the National Association of Colored People, and had fought for the integration of the public facilities in Phoenix. And the Goldwater department stores were among the first businesses in Arizona to hire black people and Native Americans. So it was a bum rap. But the media did a job on Goldwater. And I had become a Goldwater zealot. I mean, I wore his button to school. I had a Goldwater bumper sticker on my bicycle.
And how old were you at this age?
I was 12. And I would go to the Republican headquarters locally. Before the days when all mailings were done on a mass basis, we had to hand address envelopes to every voter and put a stamp on it. So I addressed and licked envelopes every day after school for a couple hours. I was totally dedicated to the election of Goldwater.
So your interest in politics started at a very extremely young age.
Yes, because that book was what captured me. What the book said was that we needed government out of our lives, out of the bedroom, out of the boardroom, out of our businesses. We wanted as little government regulation and as much personal freedom as possible. I was very attracted to that idea. We needed a strong national defense, but as a deterrent because of the concept of peace through strength. If you're strong, people won't screw with you. If you're weak, weakness is provocative. Yeah. That's very different than the neocon philosophy of the Bushes, which really has us going around the world looking for wars to get into where we don't have any inherent national interest. Oh, we're in Iraq to preserve democracy. No, we weren't. Or today that we're in Ukraine to preserve democracy. Ukraine is not a democracy. The president of Ukraine has outlawed all political parties other than his, has arrested all the candidates that ran against him in the last election. He arrests journalists. He closes down newspapers, radio stations, television stations. He's outlawed the largest church in the country. So this is most certainly not about democracy. So anyway, I was attracted by those ideas, low taxation, low regulation, strong national defense, anti-communism. I recognized then as now that communism is the single greatest evil in the world. I don't like any form of totalitarianism, obviously. Putin may not be a communist, but he's still a bad guy. He's still a murderous thug. There are still no civil liberties or freedoms in Russia or China. They are still communists. I think they are probably our greatest threat today. Maybe Iran, only because now you have an ideology of people who don't mind dying as long as they get to kill you. See, when we were fighting with the Japanese or the Germans, they wanted to dominate the world, but they wanted to live. Now we're dealing with Islamic fanatics, extremists. They don't mind dying as long as they can kill you. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Let me ask you, because you started at 12, right? At what point did you realize, because I think you've very well separated yourself from other advisors, from other people that are in the political space, you've distinguished yourself as, you're different from other people. I don't know if there's a book that you've read, A Blue Ocean Strategy. I don't know if you've read it.
I have not.
The premise of the book is that there's a blue ocean and a red ocean, right? The blue ocean is the body that there's nobody's there. The red ocean is people saying, hey, me too. Whether you're in the political world, whether you're an entrepreneur, you're doing something that somebody has already done, but you're just like, oh, me too, I do that too. And I think you have distinguished yourself from like, I'm not a me too. I'm different. I'm Roger Stone. Nobody can be Roger Stone. There's only one Roger Stone. At what point in your career, at what point did you say, yeah, I'm different?
Well, I think it's important to see it within the trajectory of my career. So after Goldwater gets destroyed, I begin reading more retroactively, and I start looking at the 1960 election. Remember, we just lost the 1964 election. I also began to realize that my hero, Barry Goldwater, had been a terrible candidate, and he'd run a terrible campaign. And I started to read about the 1960 election, and I concluded that Richard Nixon, who was then in exile in New York City, not far from where I lived in Connecticut, had been cheated out of the 1960 election, had been vastly better prepared after 8 years as vice president to be president. We're also at a time where the Vietnam War is becoming increasingly unpopular, where there is unrest in the cities as we have never seen before. We're having race riots in the country. There's unprecedented lawlessness. The size of government is getting out of control. So I wrote a letter to Richard Nixon. I mailed it to his law office, and I said, I've been looking at the 1960 election, and I'm convinced that you got screwed. They stole this from you.
You sent that in a written letter.
In a letter, because there was widespread evidence of election fraud in the 1960 election. The New York Herald Tribune, which is no longer with us, but was one of the most powerful newspapers in the country, had done a 9-part series on election fraud in the 1960 election, focusing on Illinois and on Texas and so on. Later, when I wrote my own book, I had to go to the archives of the Herald Tribune and dig around in the basement of this warehouse in New York where all the records were kept on microfiche, which was an old system for keeping records, because it was out of print. You couldn't find it. But it pretty much proves that in the 1960 election, even though Nixon, who was much better known than John Kennedy, made a series of egregious mistakes. For example, he should never have debated Kennedy. Kennedy was much lesser known. Kennedy was a very charismatic, handsome figure. Mm-hmm. The media had helped create this myth of John Kennedy as the cultured, charming, dashing, young challenger. And compared to him, Eisenhower looked kind of dowdy, looked kind of, yesterday. And there's a series of mistakes that Nixon makes in that campaign. The debates were a disaster. Well, that's not fair. The first debate was a disaster because Nixon didn't realize that how you looked and how you comported yourself on television was as important, if not more important, than what you said. Nixon was using the old debating style. He thought content mattered. Content was not what was important. It was a combination of content and appearance, optics. Beyond that, Nixon in 1960 could not make a strategic decision about whether he should try to invade the South, which at that point had never voted for any Republican, had been solidly Democrat, but very conservative, or whether, like Eisenhower, he should try to make inroads into the industrial Northeast and win black votes and minority votes in the Midwest and New York and Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so on. So he tries to do both, and it doesn't work. He makes a really foolish pledge to visit all 50 states. Well, why would you go to Vermont, which you have locked up? Why would you visit the Dakotas, where you're definitely going to win whether you show up or not? Kennedy didn't spend any time in Rhode Island, I guarantee you that. Kennedy spent his time in the swing states, the same thing we're focused on today. And then the debate turns out to be a disaster because Nixon bumps his knee on a car door, has an infection, is hospitalized for 2 weeks after Labor Day. He has to watch Kennedy crisscrossing the country on television, pulling ahead, but he's stuck in a hospital bed on antibiotics, running a fever. He's challenged to a series of debates by Kennedy. Everybody tells Nixon, don't debate this guy. He's less known than you. It will rise. You're a sitting vice president. He's just a one-term senator. It'll bring him up to your value. Eisenhower, Tom Dewey, who'd been the nominee for president in 1944 and 48, all of the senior Republicans tell Nixon he shouldn't debate. Nixon tells them, I'm not going to debate. And then they open the newspaper to find out that Nixon has agreed to 4 debates. Nixon comes out of the hospital before the doctors want to release him. He's 15 pounds underweight. He is still got a fever. He's still on antibiotics. He does 5 rallies on his way to Chicago to get 5 states out of the way. He arrives in Chicago absolutely exhausted. John Kennedy gets there early. He is sunning himself on the hotel roof with 2 hookers, 2 gorgeous hookers. When they go to the lighting check, which is kind of like the weigh-in or prize fight, they say Nixon's face was as gray as his suit. And they said Kennedy looked like a bronzed god.
I read that in the book, yeah.
Right. So Nixon loses the first debate, although those who heard it on radio thought he won, proving again the point that appearances are what matter, optics. And then he recovers in the final 3 debates. By most counts, he won the next 3 debates. The final debate, TV audience is almost as large as the first one. The historians never tell you that. And there's huge evidence of voter theft in both Chicago and Texas. Now, flipping of one of those states would not have turned the race to Nixon. But had he flipped both states, and I think he won both states, he would have been president in 1960. So I wrote him this letter, and I said, you got robbed. You should run again. And he wrote back, I still have his letter, and he said, well, that's very nice of you, but I'm probably finished with politics. If I change my mind, I'll get in touch, which was bullshit. I mean, he was planning his comeback, but timing is everything. And then 2 years later, the campaign contacted me, and they said, we have a letter on file. I remember very well because these are the days when the phone was on the wall at your home. I come from a blue-collar family. My father was a well digger. My mother was a part-time newspaper reporter for a local newspaper where she did community notes, and she also took in sewing to make a few dollars. My parents didn't go to college. They were high school graduates. And my mother came in and said, there's a man named John Whitaker on the phone with you. He says he works for Vice President Nixon. Do you want to talk to him? I said, absolutely. So I took the call, and he said, we have your letter here on file, Mr. Stone, and we're starting to hire a campaign staff and want to know if you're still interested. And I said, absolutely. And he said, well, can you come into New York City for an interview? Because unlike most presidential campaigns that run out of Washington, Nixon was running his campaign out of where he lived, New York City. So I took the train in, and when I showed up, they found out I was 16 years old, which they didn't know. They thought I was an adult because of my letter. And they were kind of saying, look, we don't really have anything, but I convinced them to take me in as a gopher. I said, I'll do anything. I mean, we didn't have copy machines yet, but I said, I'll run errands, I'll go out for coffee, I can do anything. So I got a job, really, as a gopher, starting at the 1968 Republican Convention here in Miami Beach, and I was assigned to John Mitchell, who was Nixon's law partner, campaign manager, later his attorney general, who wrongly went to jail in Watergate because he never approved the Watergate break-in. That's just false. But there was a hysteria in the country, the same kind of hysteria you saw whipped up over non-existent Russian collusion. At that age, I got to see the giants of the Republican Party of the day. These names won't mean much to you, but Nelson Rockefeller, Ronald Reagan, you've heard of him, Everett Dirksen, Billy Graham, the famous evangelist, one of the greatest men of the 20th century.
100%.
I got to see all these people come and go. In fact, they sent me out to get them coffee. Or, kid, go to Grand Central Station, meet Senator Dirksen, who was the Senate Minority Leader, and bring him to the office, and so on. So from that job, I was able to, when I went to college, get a job in Nixon's reelection because of the relationships that I had made in the 68 Nixon campaign. And because Nixon and Reagan were both from Southern California. They both came from the same political milieu. They had many, many common donors, fundraisers, advisors, staffers. It was because of my relationship with Nixon, or the Nixon people really, that I was able to get a job with Ronald Reagan. Now, in 1976, Nixon had gone down in Watergate, which was for me a very emotional thing. I remember being at the Young Republican National Committee meeting on August 9th, the day that he resigned, and I couldn't stop crying. It was a wrenching experience for me because, first of all, I thought he was getting screwed by a biased media and a hysterically partisan Congress, and Gerald Ford became president. I never much liked Gerald Ford, never much respected Gerald Ford, and kind of like Kamala Harris, nobody voted to nominate Gerald Ford for president, not at that point. But he became president without ever being voted on by the people. So when Governor Reagan decided to challenge Ford, I signed up for that. Reagan was kind of after Nixon, Reagan was my favorite political figure. Reagan had a way about him that Nixon didn't have. Nixon was a man who was uncomfortable in his own skin. He was a big picture thinker. He was brilliant, but he had trouble making small talk. He didn't really know where to put his hands. He was awkward. He mastered television in order to make the greatest comeback in history. Roger Ailes did that. Great book on this called The Selling of the President, 1968.
The Selling of the President.
Strongly recommend you read it. It's not a pro-Nixon book, but just from an informational point of view, it explains how Nixon remade himself for television.
Yeah. You know what I'm getting in between the lines?
So anyway, just to finish that out, so I went to work for Reagan. We ran a great campaign. We lost very narrowly. We lost, but very narrowly. I knew then that Gerald Ford would lose. He did. I knew that would open a door again for Ronald Reagan. At a time when many people thought Reagan was too old, I did not think he was too old. So I was one of the first people to sign up for his 1980 campaign, which of course he won. I handled the northeastern states, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, where I was from. Then, rather than go into government, which never interested me, because my interest is in politics, I formed a public affairs firm with Charlie Black and Lee Atwater and Paul Manafort, and then took a leave of absence from that firm to go back and work on Reagan's re-election in 1984. So it was in 1980 in New York that I met Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's name had been suggested to me as someone who might be interested in being on Reagan's finance committee, and I finally wangled an appointment with him through the infamous lawyer Roy Cohn, who represented him. And I had trouble meeting Cohn, but I finally got invited to a dinner party, which to me represented a free meal at that point because I was in my 20s, working, out of the Reagan campaign in New York City. And I finally got in to see Donald Trump, and I sold him on Reagan. I sold him on joining our finance committee. He and his father both raised, I think it was $100,000 for us, which in 1979 is a huge amount of money. And we became very friendly because once Trump had invested, he wanted to keep checking on his investment. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't back any losers. He's very committed to winning. So we became very good friends. And then after the election, when we opened our public affairs firm, he was among the first clients of mine. So I represented, for example, Trump hotels and casino resorts. Working for them, I met, for example, Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco, because Donald Trump had an agreement with a Native American Indian tribe that had certain casino gaming rights in California. There was thought that maybe we would put a casino, or we would acquire land, have it put in trust for the tribe, and put a casino either in San Francisco or in Oakland. So I met Willie Brown several times, and we kind of hit it off because we're both interested in clothes. I always had a distinctive interest in looking different than everyone else, looking better.
Good quality, right?
I also met Jerry Brown, the former governor, who by then was mayor of Oakland, who was an outside-the-box thinker, kind of a libertarian, interesting guy, because we were also looking at Oakland. I really liked Willie Brown. I still like Willie Brown. And even after I no longer worked for Trump, whenever I went to San Francisco on business, I would look Willie up and we would have dinner. He's a great guy. He's a master politician. He wasn't just the mayor of San Francisco. He was the Speaker of the California Assembly, which is an enormously powerful position. He was and is a great politician. So that's how I met Trump. As early as 1988, it occurred to me that Donald Trump should run for president. I mean, he wasn't impressed by any of these other candidates. I suggested it in 1988. He loved the publicity that would be generated from the idea more than I think in 1988. I'm not sure he was as serious about it as I was. If you ask him about him today, he'll say it was Roger's idea. He always loved the idea more than I did. But we made a trip to New Hampshire, like an exploratory trip. I remember that more people turned out to see his black helicopter land than had turned out to see Vice President George Bush the month before at the same Portsmouth Chamber of Commerce where he spoke. And if you look at the contents of his speech, it's very much what he's saying today. Our NATO partners should pay their fair share. Why are we paying for their defense? These trade deals, this is pre-NAFTA, pre-GATT. These trade deals, these one-size-fits-all trade deals, we're getting taken to the cleaners. We need to make deals that are good for us and good for our trading partners, not just deals that are good for them. Countries being mismanaged. Our military strength's being allowed to atrophy. We're not as strong as we used to be. And that's going to invite aggression. He was saying all these things in 1988. Anyway, he didn't run in 1988. He ended up supporting George Bush Sr., who he was never all that impressed with. And then in 2000, he was approached by Ross Perot. One thing I learned is all these billionaires know each other, okay? And he also was friendly with Jesse Ventura, who had been a professional wrestler, but who had been elected governor of Minnesota as an independent. Because Perot had run so strongly as a Reform Party candidate, it was a recognized party. It was on the ballot in most of the states. And under the federal election law at the time, once the party was nominated a candidate, they got a check for $38 million for their general election campaign. So Trump, the businessman, said, wow, run for president on somebody else's money? What a great idea. I think he was more serious about it than people thought. In the end, he concluded, and I could not disagree, that you probably couldn't get elected in the country as an independent or a third-party candidate. Had to be either a Republican or a Democrat. What he didn't want to do was take so many votes from Al Gore that he inadvertently, or from Bush that he inadvertently elected Gore. So he didn't run. What's interesting is that 3 months after he withdrew and made it absolutely clear he would not be a candidate, by law, his name was already on the ballot for the Reform Party primaries in California and Michigan, and he won both of them.
What I'm reading in between the lines is the reason why you got to where you are, the reason why you've had success, the reason why it hasn't been coincidental, the people that you've worked with, is because you took yourself serious at a young age. You were passionate, incredibly passionate and incredibly educated on things that most people aren't. And what I'm taking in between the lines is to get massive success within an industry, within your business, whatever it may be, it requires that. It requires that level of obsession. It requires that level of win at all costs. It requires that level of, you may do this, but you're not going to do it the way that I do it. And I know your time is limited, but one of the most important questions I feel like you're ever going to get asked is you've openly come out and say that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior.
Yes.
And first of all, I thank you for that, because I think the wrong side has too much of a voice, and the people that have their faith in Christ and the people that believe in good aren't as vocal as this side. Do you think that what's happening within America, the crazy riots, almost censorship of the wrong things, but the right things, and then the wrong things are being publicized, like, do you think that stems from the lack of fear of God?
Well, first of all, I am redeemed in the blood of the cross, but that only came at a time of adversity. I admit to you that although I had been baptized as a Catholic, and my mother was very strict about going to Sunday school, and we never missed Mass, and I had my first Holy Communion and my first Holy Confirmation. This ring was given to me by my grandmother when I was confirmed. But when I lived in Washington, and I became a political consultant, a public affairs consultant in the Reagan days, I was making a huge amount of money for a relatively young man. I was living a very high and pretty wild lifestyle. And I lost sight of God and God's role in my life. I still consider myself a Christian, but I wasn't acting like one, and I wasn't going to church, and I wasn't reading the Bible, and I didn't really understand how practical the Bible really is. I just thought this was a book of fables, and because the language is archaic, sometimes it's hard to understand what God's trying to tell you. Now I know you can buy a Bible with a guide that kind of explains the terminology of the day so you can understand what it is that God is saying. I also learned that all that stuff they teach you in high school and college about government and our system, and about how the judicial system is fair and there's no politics and the three branches of government are completely separate, and they don't, and politics doesn't infect them, that once the election's over, we're all Americans. All that stuff is bullshit. That's the problem. That's the way it used to be, but it's not the way it is now. So what's happened is Republican Democrat, while it's quaint and while I have a sentimental attachment to the old party of Lincoln and Goldwater, Reagan, so on, that's not really what matters. What matters is that you have a ruling global elite bent on acquiring power and money and control of people's lives, but they do not believe in God. God is completely antithetical to what they believe. They believe in a godless society. So when I was targeted by Robert Mueller, simply because I was close to Donald Trump, they wanted to find somebody who would testify against Donald Trump. They come up with this myth of Russian collusion. There's no Russian collusion. They couldn't find any. That was their problem. That's why they started to focus on me. Maybe we can put enough pressure on Stone that he'll bear false witness against Trump. He'll admit that, in cooperation with the Russians, he was involved in the hacking of the DNC and giving the information to WikiLeaks, all of which is false, all of which there is no evidence whatsoever of. And even in the beginning, I was naive enough to think, well, I'll get a fair trial and I'll have a chance to prove that this is all false. I had no idea that I wouldn't get a fair trial, that I wouldn't even be allowed to defend myself. Not in public, because I was gagged, not in the courtroom, because the judge disallowed every argument my lawyers wanted to make. I was going to do one of two things. I was either going to agree to lie or I was going to be destroyed. Those were my choices. But there was another choice. And that choice was to turn this horrific burden in which my wife and I were wiped out financially. We lost our home, our insurance, my car. I had to sell my bass guitar. I mean, we had to move to much smaller quarters. I had no income because nobody would hire somebody under criminal indictment. The newspapers kept saying I was a Russian spy. Why did I get in politics again? Oh, because I was an anti-communist. How much sense does that make? So it was in that period, as I said, that I had an opportunity to meet Franklin Graham, who was Billy Graham's son, a great apostle for the Lord. And it's not that I didn't have other clerics, priests, rabbis, pastors, all telling me to turn to God. They were telling me, but I wasn't hearing it. I was reading the Bible, but I wasn't feeling it. And then this opportunity came to meet Franklin Graham, who was visiting Boca Raton. He had an outdoor revival. I had met Billy Graham when I worked for Nixon, as I said. I still have a signed Bible that Billy Graham signed for me.
Oh, wow.
Now I have a Bible signed by Franklin Graham as well. And I got an opportunity to meet him. I met him in his tour bus up in Boca Raton. He was very generous. He gave us about 20, 25 minutes, half hour of his time. And I was still thinking politically. I said, look, Reverend Graham, they're going to lynch me here. I'm going to be killed. There's really only one way out for me, and that's executive clemency. I can't approach the president. My lawyers won't let me talk to the president. President's lawyers won't let him talk to me. So I went from talking to him virtually every day to not talking to him at all. I don't know how much he knows about my case. I don't know how much he knows about what they're trying to do to him through me. Maybe you can put in a good word for me. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do about that. But let me give you a much, much better piece of advice, because you appear to be a man under enormous stress and under enormous pressure. You need to turn your burden over to the Lord. You need to get right with Christ. You need to confess your sins. You need to put all of your faith in him. Replace your fear with faith. Replace your fear with faith. Remember him saying it very specifically. And I think you will find if you do that, and if you're sincere, if it's real, he will lift you up and he will deliver you from your persecutors. I said, well, I'll think about that. Then we went out in this field where there were about 2,000 people, on blankets and lawn chairs and so on. Could have been a Trump rally, a lot of red MAGA hats. And thanks to the people at CNN, I'm pretty recognizable. A lot of people wanted to pray with me. A lot of people wanted to just touch me and pray with me, pray for me, with me. And I sat there and I listened. And the point came in the oration by Franklin Graham, in which he said, look, I don't care what your problem is, whether it's alcohol addiction or drug addiction or family problems or financial problems or health problems or problems with the law. It doesn't matter what your problem it is. My advice to you, if you want to live forever with our Heavenly Father, if you really want redemption, turn your burden over to the Lord. Get right with God. Stand up now with me. Confess your sins, and your life will change. And that's precisely what happened. In that moment, with about 200 other Christians, I stood up, I confessed my sins, and I knew at that point that if I prayed to God, that Donald Trump would see the truth of what was being done to me, and that I would be spared dying in a dank Georgia prison for 7 to 9 years when I really hadn't done anything wrong, that I would be saved. And that's precisely what happened.
I thank you so much for your time, because the message that you just shared right now is, I believe, the message that the mainstream media isn't talking about. The message that is the message that's really going to have the most impact, because they're saying that, God will make most out of a man at his lowest. And I think that is what happened. And it's amazing that you had that testimony and you're able to share it to the world. And I hope, for you guys that are listening, that really does touch you a little bit deeper, because I truly believe that is what it's about, that it's no longer just right and left. It's really just the fight against good and evil.
It is.
And
it is an epic struggle between dark and light. It's an epic struggle between the godly and the godless.
100%.
And I would make two observations. One, that Satan never stops. He never quits. Never. So, even since the day I've been pardoned, the attacks on me and my family have been absurd. Using AI to create recordings of things I never said, recordings you can easily take out and get analyzed with a software program, and they're totally fraudulent. But there's still a big headline in the New Republic, So Satan never stops. He never stops the attack. The other thing I would say is that God often takes broken vessels. He's often taken men who are and women who are less than perfect to do his will. So I believe, yes, my life was spared for some bigger purpose. The other thing I learned is that God doesn't tell you his whole plan at once. He tells you the plan as you need to know it. All I can tell you is I'm not a saint, I'm not a savior, I'm not a prophet, I'm certainly not perfect, but I am a soldier in God's army, and I will do his will when called upon.
Walk by faith and not by sight. That's
Precisely.
what end the interview off on, because like I said, thank you a lot for your time. Guys, I just want to, make a quick time because I have read it. Stone's rules, I think we were speaking with off camera that this applies not only to the political world, but anybody, because I read this, I have a business, I have this podcast, and I was able to digest the content in here. And, I recommend this read for anybody that is serious about becoming a professional, a respected professional, whatever industry that you are in. StoneRulesBooks.com. Check it out. Like I said, Roger, thank you so much, seriously, for taking the time, and hope that you guys were able to get the value from it. Anything that you want to leave off on?
God bless you.
God bless you. God bless America. See you guys on the next one.